A lot of important talking points to get to on today's show. We're going to hit the Grady Jarrett injury news, and unfortunately, it's not good news. And then we're going to talk about Desmond Ridder because the NFL trade deadline is tomorrow, so that's going to be the biggest storyline. But I still wanted to talk about Ridder and Heinicke after the loss against the Titans. And then speaking of the NFL trade deadline, the latest trade rumors regarding the Atlanta Falcons, including in rumor/report coming in that the Falcons have already made a trade offer for an edge rusher. But let's start things off by talking about the unfortunate injury news, and that is Grady Jarrett is done for the year. He suffered a torn ACL during the loss against the Titans early in the game, and then went to the locker room, came back out of the locker room in street clothes, which was not a good sign. And unfortunately, the Falcons' biggest nightmares come to a fruition reality here that Grady Jarrett is done. He is the heart and soul of this defensive line. He is the longest tenured player on this defense. He has been an Iron Man for this team, only missing 3 games since being a 5th-round draft pick out of Clemson. Grady Jarrett is awesome. He kicks ass. He takes names, and he is not going to be with us for the rest of the year. So the Falcons have to have a next man up mentality, right? You look at the front 5 for Atlanta. They've got to find a way to replace him. That's not easy to do. But LaCal London, who came in, unfortunately got hurt later on, is probably going to be the most obvious replacement option. We'll see how serious the injury he suffered is. But more is going to be added to Onyemata's plate and Calais Campbell's plate. And they're going to need more production from Ebiketie and Bud Dupree, because Grady Jarrett, who led the team in sacks last year, is not going to be there for the rest of the year. He's not only a huge productive player for this defense, he is a big leader, so that adds more to Jesse Bates and A.J. Terrell to kind of fill that void. But I want to show Grady Jarrett some love. I'm sure he's hurting real bad right now. The guy has been an absolute warrior. He's been the most consistent piece of this defense for nearly a decade. It's pretty crazy to think that he's been there for that long. But let's show the guy some love. Like the video. Sometimes players will search their own names, see what people are saying about them, and I hope that if he comes across this video, he sees that Dirty Birds have his back and that there is 1,000 likes on today's video. Now, with that being said, we do have to have a real conversation, and that is Grady Jarrett is not coming back for the rest of the year. So Atlanta might be looking for an edge rusher a lot more than they were maybe 48 hours ago, because that need just skyrocketed, right? They were already in a good spot at edge, meaning you're 4-3 going into the Titans game. You don't necessarily have to have an extra edge rusher, but it can't hurt for a team trying to make a run and win the division. Now that you're down Grady Jarrett, one of your best pass rushers, especially on the interior, trading for an edge rusher just became a much bigger priority for Terry Fontenot. Now, before we talk about the trade rumors and whatnot, who's QB1 moving forward? That's going to be the big question for this team. Once 4 p.m. hits and the trade deadline is passed, well, we're not going to be talking about trades anymore. We're going to be talking about Week 9 against the Minnesota Vikings and who is starting for Atlanta. Arthur Smith, I want to start by saying this, can say Desmond Ridder was not technically benched. Right, went into concussion protocol, wanted to be cautious, yada, yada, yada. Let's be honest. Ridder was benched. Ridder was medically cleared. He was wearing a baseball cap on the sideline. If the Falcons were winning this game 21-17 at halftime, Desmond Ridder gets cleared from concussion protocol, and he goes out and plays the second half. But instead, Arthur Smith had an opportune time to make a change at quarterback without creating a big hullabaloo of we're benching our starting quarterback, right? That would send a big message to the locker room. That would be a tone setter for the offense and whatnot. But instead, Arthur Smith can casually go out and say, Taylor Heinicke is going to play because Desmond Ridder's hurt, except he's not hurt. He was medically cleared. He was not in concussion protocol. So Arthur Smith has a bit of a scapegoat and can blame the guy wearing the blue hat for a little bit, but that's only going to buy you a half of football. Now Arthur Smith has to make a decision. Is it Desmond Ridder or Taylor Heinicke moving forward? Desmond Ridder in Week 8 against Tennessee, once again, the turnovers. League leading 13 turnovers. Like, we came into this season saying, as long as Desmond Ridder can protect the football and hand it off to Bijan Algier and Cordero Patterson, this offense will do just fine. Instead, it's been the exact opposite of that. Really? I mean, he has turned it over. 13 times, and he's done a good job of actually moving the ball down the field through the air. Coming into this game, he was averaging 295 passing yards a game over the last 3 weeks. But it doesn't matter. 6 touchdowns doesn't mean anything when you've turned it over 13 times. Like, it's hard to turn it over that many times if you think about it. I was starting to actually come around, enjoying the very few but proud and loud Desmond Ridder stands. But it doesn't matter if you throw the ball for 295 yards a game. If you turn it over 13 times through 8 weeks of football, all that goes out the window. Like, if you throw 10 touchdowns, we can kind of make do with it. But 10 touchdowns to 13 receptions still isn't a very good ratio. But 6 touchdowns to 13 turnovers, and sure, add a couple on the ground, it doesn't matter. It does not matter what you do if you turn it over that many times. The Falcons have turned it over 2 or more times in 7 out of 8 games this year. That's incredibly difficult for a defense and a coaching staff to overcome, knowing every time Desmond Ridder walks his happy ass onto the field, not once, but twice, he goes, here's the ball. Take it. We don't want it. Like, you can prepare and game plan all you want, but turnovers, fumbles, and bad interceptions, those are not on coaching staffs. That's on the player. The coaching staff can only do so much. They're not the ones dropping the ball at the 1-inch line. They're not the ones having a fumble on a snap at the goal line. They're not the ones throwing bad interceptions in the red zone. That's not on Arthur Smith. You can put a lot of other stuff on Art, not turnovers and sloppy and ugly turnovers. And so ultimately, Desmond Ridder is going to lose his starting job sooner or later because of the turnovers. But if you had to pick a Week 9 starting quarterback, who would it be? Taylor Heinicke or Desmond Ridder? Let me know who you think should be the starting quarterback down in the comment section for this upcoming game against the Kirk Cousins-less Minnesota Vikings. I can't believe I'm actually going to say this, and I think this is just more of who I am as a sports fan. I'm always one of the last to admit to bench the quarterback or to fire the coach because those are drastic moves that you just can't put back in the bottle once you go there. So I'm going to give Desmond Ridder another opportunity, and I hate myself for even saying this, believe it or not, but he has done a good job of making accurate throws to his team and big play throws down the field. We just got to limit the turnovers. If they stop turning it over, if Ridder stops turning it over, this team and this offense will be just fine. And so I am a believer that maybe Ridder can somehow reduce the turnovers the second half of the year. Now, before we get on to the rest of today's show and talk trades, today's show is being supported thanks to our friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks, if you don't know, is a daily fantasy sports app where all you have to do is pick more or less for 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. Prize Picks is super simple and user-friendly. I spent 1 to 2 minutes on the app this morning making my selections for Monday Night Football, and this is what I'm rolling with. Josh Jacobs, less than half a touchdown. He has been booty cheeks this year. I'll take the less for sure. Jared Goff, more than 252.5 passing yards. He has been quietly a phenomenal quarterback, believe it or not. I like the more. And then Amon-Ra St. Brown, more than 79.5 receiving yards. So go to prizepicks.com/CLNS and use code CLNS for a first deposit match up to $100. The link for that, by the way, is in the comments and description of today's video. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy. Let's talk NFL trades because the NFL trade deadline is Tuesday, Halloween, 4 p.m. Eastern, and Atlanta sitting at 4-4 could go either way. There's 3 options, right? They can be buyers. They could stand pat. I don't think they'll be sellers. The only guy that I thought they could trade away was Jalen Hawkins, but then they traded him away, and then they released him. So for now, I feel like it's either going to be buyers or standing still. Now, Atlanta needs help on the defensive line, especially with Grady Jarrett gone. I would just kind of lump in edge rusher as well, but if you want to get another guy coming off the edge, that could be a spot. And then how about wide receiver, right? If you're going to continue to pass it as much as the Falcons are passing it, maybe give a couple more weapons to throw to. Plus, Drake London's groin injury could complicate things in the receiving room. Now, Atlanta's got a lot of draft ammunition to offer up in exchange for some of these trade ideas, right? They've got their own first, they have their own second. They're going to have either a second or a third. It's conditional for from the Jags based on the Calvin Ridley trade. They have their own third, a fourth, a fifth, 2 6. So right now, 8 picks altogether. So plenty of pieces to move around if they want to go out and make a move. That's not an issue. Now, the defensive line is going to be the most talked about room going into the trade deadline because Grady Jarrett is out for the season. And so you've got to find a way to replace about 62% of the snaps. And that was after he missed basically all of week 8. Before that, Grady Jarrett was playing about 65% of the snaps. So Ryan Nielsen clearly has a deep rotation going at defensive line. No one is playing over 70% of the snaps. So you got some guys, some superstar defensive players that would get over 70%. No one for Atlanta is even at like 65% technically. But they've got to find a way to make some improvements on the defensive line with Grady Jarrett out, right? And LaCale London also facing an injury after the loss in Tennessee. So I am focusing solely on the defensive line and these 6 players specifically. Danielle Hunter looked like he would be staying in Minnesota, but the Vikings just lost Kirk Cousins for the year with an Achilles injury. So maybe they do entertain a trade for Danielle Hunter. Montez Sweat and Chase Young from Washington. The Commanders are doing their best to leak. We don't want to trade him, but low-key, if you give us a really good offer, we would trade him. Carl Lawson, he's definitely going to get traded. Neville Gallimore from the Cowboys, he's just kind of lost a starting spot on that defensive line. So maybe they look to trade an experienced defensive tackle, along with Tier Tart from Tennessee. Although with the Titans winning, that could change their mood and tempo going into the trade deadline. Now, the big trade rumor that was put out there right before Sunday's game from Mike Florio over at Pro Football Talk was that the Falcons have offered a third-round pick for Commanders defensive end Montez Sweat. Whether a trade there or elsewhere happens could depend on whether the Commanders win or lose today. Well, that was before Sunday's game, and the Commanders blew a big lead to the Eagles. And so after that loss, you got to envision their phone lines are going to be busy, and they're going to be taking calls, and they're going to be considering moving on from some of their key players on the defensive side of the football, specifically Montez Sweat, who over the last 4 seasons has been extremely consistent. 5.5 sacks through 7 games so far, but 8 sacks in 17 games last year, 5 sacks in 10 games the year prior, 9 sacks in 16 games back in 2020. Montez Sweat might not be a premier number 1 edge rusher, but he is a very good and a very consistent guy who is only 27 years old and has 35.5 career sacks in 5 seasons. Where do I sign? Like, that should be it for me. A third rounder for a guy who's not 30 years old, not even 29 and turning 30 in January. 27, entering the prime of his NFL career, you could say, and all it cost you is a third-round pick. I'm in. I don't know what else I have to say. I am in. So based on this trade rumor from Mike Florio over at Pro Football Talk, would you do this trade? That's what I want to know from all of our viewers right now. Yes or no? Montez Sweat to the Atlanta Falcons for a 2024 third-round pick when the Falcons have some extra day 2 draft capital thanks to the Calvin Ridley trade. Now, if you aren't in love with Montez Sweat for whatever reason, there were some other edge rushers we looked at. Danielle Hunter and his 9 sacks so far has been outstanding. Chase Young has 5 sacks on the year. Both those players have had really good starts to the year, and they could definitely be moved from their respective teams. Now, if you want to look for a true Grady Jarrett replacement, because none of those guys play 3 to 5 technique defensive tackle routinely, Neville Gallimore and Tier Tart would fit the bill a lot better. So if you think Bud Dupree, Arnold Ebiketie, Lorenzo Carter, the rest of that edge rushing room can be okay by themselves, and you want to find a new guy on the interior defensive line, Gallimore and Tart would be the better route to go down. But ultimately, I'm going to go with Montez Sweat. Like in my last video, I talked about Chase Young over Montez Sweat, but if all it cost you is a third rounder for Montez Sweat, that's tough to pass on because that's a guy that you can get. You would likely go and extend very quickly afterwards. And you give Montez Sweat a nice 4-year contract extension, give him $16 to $17 million a season, and you're going to have a really good defensive line for the rest of the year. And then you go into 2024, getting Grady Jarrett back, having Arnold Ebiketie go into his third year, and having Montez Sweat and maybe a couple more draft picks or free agency additions round out a very formidable defensive line for Ryan Nielsen. All right, that's going to do it for us on today's show. Thank you very much for tuning in. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come hang out with us. We're going to sign off, and we're going to see you all later.